Hi, folks. Today we're going to continue on with our series of messages where we talk about heaven and the end times. We began our study by looking at Paul's letter to the church in Corinth in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 1 through 10. And then we moved over to Jesus' own words in Matthew chapter 24. In verses 1 through 8 of Matthew 24, when asked about his return, Jesus doesn't give a day or a time or an hour, but he does tell us about the pains that will come before that glorious day. He warns us that the opposition will do everything they can to keep others from experiencing the joy of that day by spreading lies about it. He tells us that wars and conflicts will be widespread before we get closer to that day. He tells us about the hardships that will be present as well. He points to famine and earthquakes as a sign of the end times. In verses 9 through 14, we looked at other signs of the end times as Jesus warns about attacks on believers, both physical and spiritual. But he also explains that there is hope for those who stand firm to the end, and that the good news will be spread to the nation. And so today we're going to continue on with verses 15 through 21 in a message entitled Signs of the End Times, the Temple and Judea. Let's take a closer look at those verses in Matthew chapter 24, verses 15 through 21. And when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let no one on the housetop go down to take anything out of the house. Let no one in the field go back to get their cloak. How dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. Pray that your flight will not take place in winter or on the Sabbath. And then there will be great distress, unequaled from the beginning of the world until now, and never to be equaled again. In these verses, Jesus is warning his disciples about what lies ahead. As he often did, Jesus points back to the words of the prophets in the Old Testament, Daniel's prophecy. As we discussed several times before, the Old Testament contains numerous prophecies that have already been fulfilled. The birth, life, ministry, death, and resurrection of Jesus alone fulfill many of those prophecies. In today's passage, Jesus points to the words of Daniel. Daniel had already foretold the timing of Jesus, the Messiah's arrival and death. The disciples that were gathered around Jesus were probably not fully aware of that, but Jesus knew. Now Jesus shares these words with them. And so when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation spoken through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand. Jesus tells the listener to go back and look at the words of the prophet Daniel. In the interest of time, let's focus on this one passage in Daniel chapter 9, beginning at verse 20. For I was speaking and praying, confessing my sin and the sin of the people Israel, and making my request to the Lord my God for his holy hill. And while I was still in prayer, Gabriel, the man I had seen in the earlier vision, came to me in swift flight about the time of the evening sacrifice. He instructed me and said, Daniel, I have now come to give you insight and understanding. And as soon as you began to pray, a word went out, which I have come to tell you, for you are highly esteemed. Therefore consider the word and understand the vision. 77s are decreed for your people and your holy city to finish transgression, and to put an end to sin, to atone for wickedness, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy place. Know and understand this. From this time, the word gets out to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until the Anointed One, the ruler, comes. There will be 7 sevens and 72 sevens. It will be rebuilt with streets and a trench, both in times of trouble. About 72 sevens, after the 72 sevens, the Anointed One will be put to death and will have nothing. The people of the ruler who will come will destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end will come like flood. War will continue until the end, and the desolations have been decreed. He will confirm a covenant with many for 1 7. In the middle of the 7, he will put an end to sacrifice and offering. And at the temple, he will set up an abomination that causes desolation until the end that is decreed is poured out on him. You see, in this passage, Gabriel passes along vital information to Daniel. This prophecy specifies 70 weeks or 70 sets of 7 years, totaling 490 years, decreed for the Jewish people. From the decree to rebuild Jerusalem in 1444 BC, 69 weeks, 483 years would pass until the appearance of the Messiah, the Anointed One. Jesus, the Anointed One, was now standing before his disciples and pointing back to the words of Daniel. In doing so, would the disciples catch what Daniel was saying? In Daniel 9:26, it says this: after the 72 sevens, the Anointed One will be put to death and will have nothing. This verse talks about the sacrificial death of the Anointed One. This same Jesus that was talking to them would die for the sins of others. It had all been written right there in the book of Daniel for everyone who could understand it. Jesus knew that, and that he was a fulfillment of that prophecy. But he also wanted to share some of those things that were still yet to come. Yes, he would be put to death on the cross and the resurrection. But there were still other prophecies there as well. In his words in Matthew chapter 25, verse 15, Jesus says this: so when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation, spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand. Jesus is pointing to the words in Daniel chapter 9, verses 26 and 27, where it says, the people of the ruler will destroy the city and the sanctuary. The end will come like a flood. War will continue until the end, and desolations have been decreed. He will confirm a covenant with many for 1 7, and in the middle of the 7, he will put an end to the sacrifice and offering. And at the temple, he will set up the abomination that causes desolation until the end that is decreed is poured out on him. By referring to this, Jesus is pointing out that what will happen, he was pointing out what will happen after his death on the cross. In doing so, he goes back to where his discussions with his disciples began in the first part of Matthew chapter 24, the destruction of the temple. Remember verses 1 through 3? Jesus left the temple and was walking away when his disciples came up to him to call attention to the buildings. Do you see all these things? He asked. Truly I tell you, not one stone here will be left on the other. Every one will be thrown down. As Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately. Tell us, they said, when will this happen, and what will be the signs of the coming of the end of the age. After talking about the destruction of the temple in verse 2, Jesus once again returns to the subject in verse 15. In his words, in verse 15, Jesus says, "So when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand." Abomination refers to something disgusting or profane, like idolatry. Desolation means destruction, leading to a state of emptiness or abandonment of the holy place. As we know, the destruction of the temple wasn't really that far in the future. In 70 CE, Roman General Titus launched a siege on Israel. According to the writer Josephus, a Roman soldier took a torch and threw it against the beautiful tapestries that Herod had made for the temple and that had hung along its walls. When they caught fire, the Romans attempted to put it out, but there was not sufficient water. Somehow the fire was so intense that even the stone took hold and the building collapsed. The entire temple, along with thousands of Jews, burned. Many of the distraught defenders jumped into the flames, feeling that if the temple was going up in flames, then the Jewish people were also going up in flames. Desperation and despair were so rampant that thousands and thousands of Jews committed suicide. The temple, a central symbol of Jewish worship and identity, was destroyed in a fire, marking the end of the sacrificial system that had been central to the Jewish religious life. After Titus claimed the temple, he made his own sacrifices within its walls. And so you have the desecration. This would account for the fulfillment of the words, the abomination that causes desolation. Jesus was warning the disciples that the fall of the temple, as prophesied in Daniel, was coming. As we look back in history, we see his words were truly accurate. The destruction was not just an end to the temple, though. It would have a devastating impact on the people of Judea and Jerusalem as well. The impact on Judea and Jerusalem. Look at what Jesus says next in verse 16. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let no one on the housetop go down to take anything out of the house. Let no one in the field go back to get their cloak. How dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. Pray that your flight will not take place in winter or on the Sabbath. And then there will be great distress, unequaled from the beginning of the world until now, and never to be equaled again. With the destruction of the temple, the Romans continued a war of extermination against the Jews. Rome pushed the rebels back to the upper city and Herod's palace, where they would make their last stand. Significantly weakened, the Jews were unable to defend themselves. Without the manpower to defend, Jerusalem had been conquered. The war, however, would continue for 3 more years. The final place controlled by the Jews was the fortress Masada. The Jews built a great ramp up the sheer face of the cliff, remnants of which still remain today. They used 30,000 Jewish slaves to build that ramp, thus putting the defenders in an awful dilemma of firing upon their own people to prevent the completion of the ramp. When the ramp was almost complete, and it was obvious that the Romans would assault the walls and win, Elzar ben Yair, the Jewish leader of at the Masada, called a meeting and declared that they were not going to allow themselves to become slaves of Rome. Instead, they would commit suicide. And when the Romans finally entered the fortress in the morning, they found only corpses. According to the historians, 1.1 million people were killed during the Roman siege. Males aged 17 and older were either put in hard labor camps or made into gladiators. Women and children were sold into slavery. Knowing that this would happen, Jesus warned the listeners to prepare for that day. He told them in verse 16, "Let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains." Get away, he said. The city would not be a safe place for them. He told them in verses 17 and 18 to leave quickly and not to go back. Jesus described what those future times would be like. In verse 19, he says this, "How dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers." For the people of Judea and Jerusalem, Jesus says in verse 21, "For then there will be great distress unequaled from the beginning of the world until now, and never to be equaled again." So what does that mean? First of all, this goes to show that the written word, the prophecies, and the words of Jesus are all true. We can look back at history and see them fulfilled. That helps us to have faith that the other prophecies will come to pass as well. As Jesus tells us about the signs of the end times, we need to pay close attention to what he says. We can also see many of those signs in our world today. Those birth pains seem to be increasing more and more in both frequency and intensity. We need to follow God's word closely and faithfully prepare ourselves for the days that are ahead. Just like we prepare for hurricanes, we need to prepare ourselves for the end times. We need to mature in our Christian walk. We need to make the most of every day as we get one day closer every day and the birth pains increase. And with all that said, we need to look forward to that one glorious day when he will return. Look at what it says in Daniel chapter 7 about that day. In verse 13 it says, "In my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. And he approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. And he was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and the peoples of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed." Folks, as we get closer and closer to those end times, learn to live and walk by faith. Learn to spread his message and share it with others so that they too can experience that glorious day. I love you all. I miss you all. May God bless each and every one of you.